Okay, guys, welcome to the study. Glad you're here, and looking forward to another time in which we'll be able to think about the Word of God together. We are in Proverbs. We're studying from the wisdom that God gave to Solomon, and through Solomon and the other writers of this great work has blessed us. So, Proverbs chapter 25 and in verse 20 is where we're scheduled to begin. In this passage, the text reads as, "He that takes away a garment in cold weather, and as vinegar upon nitre, so is he that singeth songs to an heavy heart." He makes two comparisons, two illustrations with the main point of this proverb. He talks about taking away a garment in the cold weather. That's a rather odd reference. Most people think that it perhaps goes back to the book of Deuteronomy and the old law. In the law of Moses, you remember how that God gave to Moses a law that was not just religious in its nature. At that particular time, God had a nation on earth, a physical nation. And the instructions of the law just range from matters of worship to how to handle disease and all kinds of things in between. So legal matters such as how to lend money, when to lend money, how to handle those who are your debtors, and so on. All of this we find in the law. And it's along that latter line there in chapter 24 of Deuteronomy and in verse 17 that we find these words, "Thou shalt not pervert the judgment of the stranger, nor of the fatherless, nor take a widow's raiment to pledge." The word there, pledge, might be translated, and is by some of the translations, as a guarantee for a loan. So you're going to loan a poor widow money, and what collateral does she have? Well, clothes on her back. And a man might be so evil, so vicious as to take away the coat of a widow in the cold. That's the kind of thing we're talking about here. It's a rather heartless act, and it certainly doesn't go together. The idea of taking away from a poor person protection in such times rather than giving it to them. So the idea of taking away a garment in cold, those two things don't go together. And then he also gives the comparison, the illustration, if you will, of vinegar upon nitre. That word nitre is identified by Mr. Strong's as mineral potash. Brown, Driver, and Briggs suggest that the substance referred to would be carbonate of soda. And I'm really not educated enough to know all the differences there between something of that nature and our baking soda, but I think they'd be fairly similar. I do remember in the science classes I didn't sleep through, even in elementary school, when you're little, the go-to science project was the old papier-mâché volcano, and then you would have baking soda in a little cylinder there in the middle, and you'd, when the time came, pour the vinegar in, and those two substances would react in a rather mildly violent way, and the overflow there would mimic lava and so on. I don't know if anybody does that anymore or not, but in a simpler time, that seemed to be impressive, at least at that age. But that's the basic idea. When you put these two substances together, they don't go together very well. One would tend to ruin the other, and there might be a rather, again, as I said, mildly violent at least, reaction between the two. It would be a rather hateful picture, these two substances. So here's the idea. You're taking away clothes from people who need them when it gets cold. That doesn't go together. you put the vinegar and the niter. Those don't go together. And here's something that doesn't go together either. Singing songs to a heavy heart. The idea is that here we are whistling and cheerful when someone else is hurting, someone else is in mourning, in times of difficulty. Well, let me offer this point, and I don't think that this proverb is intended to be taken so absolutely that it would not recognize that sometimes people might need to be cheered up. Sometimes people who are in the throes of grief might find great comfort in a diversion, a distraction, and so on. We'll grant all that to be true. But I think the point of the passage is, and I think we've seen this in some of the previous proverbs we've been looking at recently, when we talk about the idea earlier of not lingering unwisely in our friend's house. The idea there is not that there's not gain in fellowship and time together with friends. It is that we must always be moderating our desires by how it affects others. That's, I think, the point. And the same is true here. As one fellow wrote, we need to be sensitive to the feelings of others. That's obviously so. This fellow's going through a hard time. He's in the throes of grief. And so don't be so callous as to not recognize that, and at least consider, how will my tone or my actions affect his mindset and what he's going through? Brother Harkrider wrote about this passage, do not speak without forethought of how it will affect others. Mr. Bridges added to that, though no unkindness is intended, inconsiderate levity, that's his expression. And I think that's probably a good way to summarize what the wise man is talking about here. Inconsiderate levity. There's a place for levity, but inconsiderate levity is like a sword in the bones. The tenderness that knows how to weep with those that weep, mourn with those that mourn. That's a godly sympathy. And that's, I think, the lesson to be learned. To be sure, as another fellow wrote, grief has its place. And we ought to be sympathetic with that. But it is possible for us to be so wrapped up in our self that we are oblivious to what people are going through. And this is just not what wisdom and kindness and godliness are about. So what's the point of this proverb? I think the point is realize that somehow your ill-timed words or attitude might be inconsiderate at the least and discouraging and aggravating, out of place with others who may be in a very different place mentally. So be careful, I think. Be considerate of other people. Sometimes people talk about reading the room, and I'm not all that good at that. And that's something we're trying to get better at, is recognizing other people have feelings too, and how will what I'm going to do or say affect them at this time. Okay. Let's look at another, if we might, going back to our text in Proverbs 25. In verse 21, if thine enemy hunger, give him bread to eat. And if he be thirsty, give him water to drink. For thou shalt heap coals of fire upon his head, and the Lord shall reward thee. When he talks about giving bread and giving water, I think we can understand there more than just those two things. The idea is giving the necessities of life to those who are in need, even those who may have at some point mistreated us. They have become our enemy, and maybe for good reason. And yet there is a mercy even to those for whom we feel no natural affection. He describes that as being coals of fire dumped on his head. I think we've probably all heard the old illustration. It's said that in this particular case, I think it was a woman who was having an unpleasant relationship with her husband. And so she's angry at him and considers him almost an enemy, and goes to some wise counselor who asks her, well, have you tried heaping coals of fire on his head? And her response was something like, well, I hadn't gone that far yet, but I did threaten him with a frying pan. Well, she had missed the point. Obviously, when he talks here about heaping coals of fire, it's not, I think, a malicious act. It's not intended to try and consume somebody, but maybe, as one fellow said, to melt them in another sense, to melt them with kindness, to soften their heart, not with a return of evil, but return of good for evil. There's a commentary written by two fellows, Kyle and Dalish, and in their commentary, and I'm quoting here, he says, the burning pain, as commonly observed, is the figure of burning shame, an account of this burning shame comes on account of undeserved kindness shown by an enemy. Undeserved kindness. We've probably all been in that situation before. I'm ashamed to say. When we may not have been as kind to others as we should have been, and yet they nevertheless showed kindness to us. And for most people, not for everybody, but for most people, there is a burning shame that goes with that. It strikes deep. That kind of action can have a greater effect on us maybe than hostile words would. We wouldn't be as moved by threats or by cursings as we are by kindness. There is a great example, a famous example of that back over in the Old Testament in 1 Samuel 24. And you remember, this is during the time when David is fleeing from Saul. David has been an absolutely faithful servant of the king, but the king knows that God has selected David to replace him one day. And so he's jealous of David, angry with David on that account, and seeks to destroy him. So, as the case is, David finds himself with the ability, the opportunity to destroy Saul. Saul has gone into a cave where David actually is hiding. Saul has no idea David is anywhere near, and David could easily have taken the king, unarmed as he was, and destroyed his life in a moment. He spares Saul, and Saul realizes that David has done this. And in the aftermath of this returning good for evil, here the fellow that I've been chasing around and slandering has me in the palm of his hand and decides to do me good instead of evil. In that moment, we remember these words. This is 1 Samuel 24 and verse 16. David makes himself known. And Saul said, "Is this thy voice, my son David?" And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. And he said to David, "Thou art more righteous than I, for thou hast rewarded me good, whereas I have rewarded thee evil. And thou hast showed this day how thou hast dealt well with me." And then he goes on in verse 19, "The Lord reward thee good for that thou hast done unto me this day." Of course, we'd like to think that that lasted with Saul. As it turned out, it didn't. But even on this half-crazed heart given over to bitterness, the act of David, the idea of returning good for evil, stopped him in his tracks. And we don't suggest that everybody is going to be won over by goodness, that everybody, not all people have a conscience. We grant all that to be true. But be that as it may, it's still the right way. It's still pleasing to God. And it's not an accident. It's not at all surprising. This is the very language that we find brought over in the New Testament. In the book of Romans, the 12th chapter and verse 20, "Avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath." It is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Therefore, if an enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. And so doing, thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. The Apostle Paul, in teaching us, Romans 12 is that great chapter, really, that speaks to the character of a Christian. Paul would say, whether you're Jew or Gentile, all men need this character. And he describes in such glorious terms, by inspiration of God, what it means to be a Christian, what a Christian looks like. And a part of that is that Christians don't return evil for evil. And that's, of course, mirroring what the Lord taught when he was upon the earth in Matthew chapter 5. Is there a more challenging, more difficult command the Lord ever gave? It hath been said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, I say to you. Whosoever shall smite thee on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. It hath been said, love your neighbor, hate your enemy. I say, love your enemies. Bless those that curse you. Do good to those that hate you. Pray for those which despitefully use you and persecute you. Notice, that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. He sends the rain on the just and the unjust. And he says, if you just treat well people who treat you well, anybody do that. The sign of those who are my people is they return good for evil. Be perfect even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. That's how that last verse of the chapter, as we divide this book, that's how it reads. So it is here. This is a thought we find in the Proverbs. This is a part of wisdom. Wisdom is restrained. Wisdom does not seek to avenge itself. Wisdom returns good for evil. And that is a powerful statement. Okay. I like this quotation. This is also from Brother Harkrider. He talks about those who fail to do that and those who give in to what we might call bitterness. We know from the standpoint of taste, things that are bitter are things that are sharp and harsh, that are unpleasing. And there's a heart that can become bitter. Pikros, I think, is the word of the New Testament. And it's the very same thing brought over in a symbolic sense to a man's attitude. It becomes sharp and it becomes unpleasing. And it can absolutely destroy us. Brother Harkrider writes, even if your enemy is calloused and rebels at kindness, you render to yourself peace of mind. If you do the right thing, even if he doesn't respond, even if goodness doesn't win him over, nevertheless, it's better for you to return good for evil and not allow bitterness to take root in your heart. He goes on, those who cannot forgive destroy themselves by a mental cancer that's called hate, which eats away at every fiber of their being. So here is wisdom. Wisdom is return good for evil, because in doing so, it may well be that you destroy your enemy by making a friend out of him. I've destroyed my enemy. I can't find an enemy anymore. Where in the place of an enemy, I find a friend. Glory. But even if that's not so, we behave in the way that God would have us behave, and we please him whenever we follow the right way and do not be drugged down the wrong path. That's the point. We'll live a happier life. We'll please God, and we may well help that other fellow. Glory in that case. Offer this sacrifice to God. Forgo vengeance. Okay, back to our text in Proverbs 25 and verse 23. Here we find this statement made. The north wind drives away rain, so doth an angry countenance a backbiting tongue. Other translations read a little bit differently. We'll talk about that in just a second. Let me start by looking at that word backbiting. In the old King James translation, you may have slander, and I think that's the idea. but maybe even beyond that. The idea of backbiting, that word suggests secret slander. Here is some nasty thing, some vicious remark made away from the hearing of the one concerned and shared with someone who ought not to be burdened with it. Secret slander. Gossip is another word for it. Secret gossip, if there's a difference. The idea of spreading tales about another person. So here's the idea of one who backbites with their speech. And what the text says is, as the north wind drives away rain, so doth an angry countenance a backbiting tongue. The countenance is the face of the individual. And he says here that the angry face, that word anger is an interesting word too. It suggests the idea, literally it's a strong word, almost foaming at the mouth, literally the idea is someone who is enraged. Now the Old King James reads, as the north wind drives away rain, so doth an angry countenance a backbiting tongue. Other translations render that first part a little bit differently. That word there, driveth away, is from a Hebrew word huel, and it is defined literally as to whirl, to writhe, and then to tremble, to travail, to anguish, to be in pain, and then to bring forth. Now, with that definition in mind, there are those who have translated this passage a little bit differently. The American Standard, the English Standard Version, the New International Version, most others translate the passage something like this. The north wind brings forth rain, and a backbiting tongue and angry countenance. Just like the north wind brings rain, cause and effect, so it is a backbiting, slanderous tongue will bring forth an angry countenance. A man who is a gossip, a man who is a slanderer, will ultimately bring wrath upon himself. He's going to bring the wrath of the fellow who he's been talking about when he finds out what he's been saying about him. And maybe also he will engender the displeasure, the anger of the people whom he's trying to talk to. Those who are the appointed listeners of his slander. They're going to turn against him as well. You know, people, not everybody, some love gossip. They love to hear some dirt about somebody. But this passage seems to indicate in this reading that just as surely as the wind brings the rain, a man who goes about gossiping about his neighbor is going to find people looking at him, the gossip, differently. They'll realize how unfair what he's saying is. It will cause them to hear him differently in everything else he says. They are not so silly as to think that if he's slandering old fellow over here, to me, he's probably talking about me to somebody else. You know, that's the nature of this gossip. He's unfair. He's sharp and unkind in his tongue. So there is a message there that it's a short-lived thing. There's an old saying, it takes two to gossip, and there are some who enjoy such behavior. But others just look at this fellow with a very different look now because they realize by what he's done what character is there or what character is lacking. A lot of good sermons have been preached through the years on gossip, and we need them. I need them. We need to be careful about the things that we say. And we've been, I think, instructed many times something along this line, that before you say something about someone else outside of their presence, I'm talking about you and you're not here. There are three things that we ought to always ask ourselves and check ourselves before we utter such a word. Is what we're saying true? Is it kind? Is it necessary? You've heard that, something along that line. I still think that's a really good point to make. I mean, is it even true? I don't even know if this is true or not. I heard, well, is it kind? Would I want somebody else talking about me in this way? Sometimes you have to tell things about other people that are not pleasant. And there's a purpose for it. There's a reason for it. It's called for by the situation. We acknowledge that. But always in our tongue is the law of kindness. Is this necessary? Really? What good will be done from this? Sometimes it's essential that we say the thing that's hard to say, that we offer the true criticism of another person. Souls are at stake. Important things. But just idle gossip, passing along stories we don't even know if they're true or not for no other reason than just the joy of being looked at and listened to for a minute, without any thought about the damage that might do. I think there are an awful lot of people who have been damaged and hurt no little because of some untrue thing that was spread about them. And unfair people never checked out the story. And so they were forever changed in the minds of those hearers. This is a really important point. Now, our proverb is stressing the fact that going back to the New King James and the others, as the north wind brings forth rain, a backbiting tongue, and angry countenance. We ought to put a stop to that kind of unfair speech. And if somebody comes along telling a tale about someone, we ought to stop and ask ourselves the question, are we sure this is true? And why are you telling me this? Have you talked to them about it? Those are the kinds of questions that ought to come up in our mind. And frankly, it'd put a stop to gossip if the people they were trying to share this news with would just hand it back to them and ask them to do the right thing. Now, the King James rendering, just a little bit different. It takes this word, bring forth, in the opposite direction, hold back, and there are different reasons for that. I don't have much to get into this. But I think the basic lesson comes out about the same way. The idea of the King James seems to be as the north wind holds back the rain. And by the way, they tell me in Palestine, the north wind doesn't bring the rain. The rain comes from the west. And so it's a restraining force, this might be taken. So an angry glance holds back slander. Same lesson. I think whichever way he's talking about it, the bottom line is there's a cause and effect. And an angry glance holds back slander. That's the New English Bible and its translation there. Don't be a ready recipient for gossip. Don't engage in it. Don't listen to it. Again, one more time, just for clarity here. There are times when hard things have to be said and must be heard. But that's not what we're talking about in this passage. Just idle gossip can be put to a stop, and it needs to stop with us. And if I'm the one that's tempted to start it, I need to stop before I start. That's a good lesson for me, and I think for any of us. Okay. Back to our text then. Proverbs 25 and verse 24. It is better to dwell in the corner of the housetop than with a brawling woman in a wide house. This is an unforgettable way of phrasing this lesson. We have read things like this before, just over in the 21st chapter. In verse 9, the same point is made. And then in 21:19, the same lesson is taught in slightly different terms. Verse 19 of chapter 21 reads, "It is better to dwell in the wilderness than with a contentious and angry woman." And so here in our passage, better to dwell in the corner of the housetop than with a brawling woman in a wide house. The corner of the housetop. It's been pointed out before that in ancient times, in many places, and I guess in some places now, in a flat-roofed building, people use the roof as a dwelling place. But certainly there's nothing inviting about this picture, the corner of the housetop. Some place that's very confining or very precarious, in danger of falling off, as the case might be. And yet, the wise man says that tight, even dangerous place would be preferred to a wide space with this woman. One fellow made the point that the word, I guess, is broad enough to include a sister or a mother, but we think of it from these other passages as a wife. And so in a wide house, it's no place to be if you're there with someone who has a brawling nature and attitude. The word that's used here is translated contentious, strife-ridden. Some of the other translations here in our passage read bitter-tongued. One reads nagging. One reads a woman who is always arguing. Another, a woman who is quarrelsome. Well, there are a lot of things to say about this. Let me just hasten to make this point. These warnings are given for a reason. One fellow wrote that, Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. He might have been speaking from experience. But I think even more than that, the reason why this lesson is taught over and over again here is, I think, because there is an importance that's laid out for us. And let me just add this as well. He does use the illustration of the brawling wife, but it's no better bargain to have a brawling, contentious, bitter-tongued husband. Whichever way we would point this in a marriage, it would be a bad thing. And you'd be better off sitting on the roof than you would be in a wide house with someone who had this type of bitter tongue. So what's the lesson? What do we learn from all of this? What do we gain? Well, a couple of lessons come to mind. One would be that if we're right in understanding this in the context of marriage, it reminds us we better know well the character of those we're marrying. In this case, let's just take the circumstance of a husband with his wife who has turned out to be a very bittersome, quarrelsome individual.